I'm Weird Al Yankovic, and you're listening to the Pantheon Network.
Hey, I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to Season 7, Episode 8 of Music is Not a Genre. Thank you for joining me, as always. Here, let's do the hand gestures. Why not? MxG. All right, I'm going to put up a tutorial on those. No, I'm not. Thank you, as always, for watching and listening. Listeners, go to youtube.com/@musicisnotagenre to get a video for every episode of this podcast. Watchers, go to nickdimatteo.com/musicisnotagenre, and you can stream just the audio anywhere if you prefer not to see our lovely faces. And everyone, go to patreon.com/musicisnotagenre to support this podcast and my band Rex Music. Also, of course, the sponsor for this show, one of the sponsors this season is Qobuz, Qobuz. They are high-res music streaming service that has about as much music as Spotify or Apple. It costs about the same per month, but for that base price, you get much better quality music and you get a lot of extra features and perks and more a hands-on approach. So I do recommend checking that out. Let's get to the topic. This is BackTalk 5 with Steve Erickson, the Realest fake bands. So today we're going to be talking about a bunch of fake bands, and I'll explain that here in the intro before I introduce Steve. I have been somewhat obsessed with music featured in television and film that's done by totally made up artists for many, many years. In fact, you see, if I pull back here, you can see my t-shirt. It says Mexican Funeral. That's actually a fake band from the show, the American version of the show, Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency, starring Elijah Wood. I think it lasted 2 seasons, maybe 1 season, something like that. But I love the idea of it so much that I bought the shirt. So you can see how obsessed I am with that. This started way, way back when I noticed, from the standpoint of being a musician and music creator, how packaged so much of that supposedly authentic fake music sounded. And in the context of the series or the film, sure, it's acceptable. It does the trick. It kind of fills that slot. But to someone who's done a ton of different kinds of music, or at least been around other musicians who have, it always very often sounded like a pale imitation to me. Sometimes that was due to the performance or the recording itself being too polished. More often, it was because whoever wrote the songs was imitating a style and not embodying the style. And you can tell the difference. It kind of reminds me of, and I don't know why I'm thinking of the first Super Mario Brothers movie from the early 90s in particular, but there have been so many movies that have created a futuristic world where everybody's at a dance club, and the dance club is dark and sexy and sinister in some way. And they always have this kind of pseudo futuristic music that's supposed to sound like the club looks, but it almost always comes off as posing like that and not really like that. Now, in many cases, the creators, the producers didn't use the real thing because they couldn't afford the licensing. You know, they didn't have the money to buy it, or in often, and this happens in things like sci-fi, but even more so in non-sci-fi, where they wanted to create an alternate world where that band existed and allow that to be part of the storyline, which is a lot easier to do when you create the band yourself. You can think of, I mean, the entire movie Almost Famous was based on a fake band, you know, Sweetwater, or the band in the Tony Award-winning show Stereophonic is completely made up. And there's so many others, which, by the way, we're not going to get to all of them. I'll tell you how many I discovered. Whatever the reason, as a musician who's been in several kinds of bands, created even more kinds of music, very few of those made-up acts pass the smell test. To me, it's like when Broadway tries to do rock music. It usually, again, ends up being way too polished. And frankly, it makes me feel uncomfortable and a little awkward, disappointed, and slightly pissed, because there are plenty of great writers and performers, musicians, singers who could do that kind of music better justice, but you end up with a pale imitation even on Broadway. So yes, this episode was inspired by my obsessive TV watching, but more specifically, the pleasant surprise of hearing fake bands whose material actually stands up And those are some of the bands we're going to be talking about in this episode. In particular, this was inspired. I watched a show called DC's Legends of Tomorrow on the CW. It was better than it should have been, frankly. And in some ways, it was better than its sister shows because it never took itself too seriously, or at least after the second season or starting the second season. And that allowed it to loosen up and kind of go places other shows didn't go. And in one of those storylines, a member of the team was in a late 70s punk band called The Smell. And I was ready for it to be pretty lame, like most pretend punk is. But I was honestly blown away by how good it was. And I looked it up, and it turns out that the music was performed. I don't know if it was written, but at least performed by the veteran British punk band, the Drones. I'm not sure who wrote the songs, but whoever did added in a lot of the idiosyncrasies that most fake music doesn't do or tries way too hard to do. So that's kind of the inspiration for this episode. Having done some research, and thankfully I have Steve Erickson as as the co-host here, who's done a lot more research. I found a list of over 6,000 fake acts from film and television, commercials, and the web. So yeah, we're not going to cover all that. But again, frequent MxG contributor Steve Erickson is back to help me hone down this list. And I'll introduce him in a second. But first, the show rundown. My sources actually are fakebands.com, tvtropes.org, mubi.com, our sources, I should say, Wikipedia and Reddit. Actually, there was an interesting article on Reddit where I found out some information. We're going to go through the first half here. Steve and I are going to talk about the idea of fake music artists in general and focus in on some of the better known fake acts in TV and film. And that will include a little bit of interesting talk on how IP, intellectual property ownership, affects these fake artists and how often you see them. The second half, we're going to talk about other fake acts that were not necessarily associated with film or TV. And that's going to bleed a little into a discussion of AI, which of course everybody's talking about. And I'll talk a little bit about how that type of AI for fake bands, fake acts has been around longer than we've been talking about it. And then we'll get into some conclusions. And I even have a special featured song for you at the end of the episode by a fake band that I created. So that's my spiel. That's my intro. Steve, how are you today?
Pretty good. How are you?
Not bad. I know we're both a little frazzled. It's been a bit of an exhausting couple of weeks. So, we're going to have a little more fun maybe with this episode than might have been planned. We have done some research and all of that, but I'm grateful that you're here to talk about this.
Did your role in the Sopranos prequel, does that count as a fake band?
I don't know. Yes, sure. I'll say yes. I was Frankie. I don't have a last name, so it was the band Frankie. Yeah. That's great. Oh man, I totally forgot about that. So I know we wanted to start jumping right in, talking about fake acts, bands, etc., that have been featured in television and film. And there are a few that I have listed here, which I would love for you to just, jump in on the ones that you've done some research on. But you people out there, be prepared for, some of these to be discussed in depth. Of course, there's Spinal Tap, new movie coming out. We're going to talk about that. How could you not talk about the Monkees and the Blues Brothers? I'm particular to the Flight of the Conchords. Mau Mau's is one that Steve mentioned. There was a film in 2014 called Frank, starring Michael Fassbender and Donald Gleason, based on a real British band, the Freshies, and their lead singer's persona, Frank Sidebottom. Steve mentioned the Joes and the Pussycats 2001, but also the cartoon itself from the 70s, I guess, and 80s really did some stuff. There was another 80s cartoon called Jem and the Holograms that was their own thing. Then you have the Partridge Family, you have the Brady Bunch, and who did release songs as acts. Space Ghost and SpongeBob and Metalocalypse with the band Death Clock and Aqua Teen Hunger Force. They all had fake music, fake acts. In particular, Aqua Teen Hunger Forces was MC Pee Pants. So enjoy that. Teen Titans, has the newest version of Teen Titans has done quite a bit with fake music and fake acts, and it's amazing how close they get to the spirit of the original music that they're trying to shoot for. So, Steve, uh, those acts that you mentioned in particular, Spinal Tap, Monkeys, Blues Brothers, Mau Mau's, Josie and the Pussycats, where would you like to start?
Well, in chronological order, the Monkees, I think, are the earliest of the fake bands that you've mentioned. It seems like after that, it went into late 60s and early 70s bubblegum pop. Where did the Archies have a TV show? That
Yes,
um
cartoon, yeah, that they've spin
the,
off.
the thing with the Monkees is that although they started out purely as a creation for the TV show, and they didn't play any of the instruments on their first album, that they eventually took control over their music. If have you seen their movie Head?
Yes. A friend of mine who's a huge Monkeys fan recommended it to me, and I watched it maybe 2 years ago. Pretty wild trip.
Yeah, I remember watching MTV reran the '60s show when I was a teenager, and I remember watching it then and thinking this is really strong. The TV they put a lot more effort into the TV show. When they it could have just been a very lazy ripoff of A Hard Day's Night.
Yeah, I feel like both the songwriters they use, the musicians, and the writing of the show itself, they got some great talent there. And I know that you'll probably mention, like you said, they kind of took over and spun out to become a real band, playing their own instruments, and Mike Nesmith and especially, but maybe some of the others contributed songs and all of that.
Yeah, have you heard Mike Nesmith's early solo albums?
Only
From
a couple of those songs, yeah.
Yeah, they're very early country rock, or what we would now call Americana. They're much different from the Monkees, and you can tell that he had a lot of ambition and ideas that he couldn't really work out as part of the Monkees.
Oh, that's something I'd like to actually listen to. I've listened to the whole Monkeys catalog, including that recent one before the other two died. That was very, very good. The Adam Schlesinger run kind of thing. And I know all that, but I don't know Mike Nesmith's solo work that much.
It's strange how Adam Schlesinger is a has been involved with so many of these projects. He found some way in with the backing band for the Josie and the Pussycats movie. They played the music. Um, did you see the TV show Crazy Ex-Girlfriend?
No, but
He
I've heard about it.
he wrote the music for that. He wrote the music for the fake band The Wonders in Tom Hanks's film The Thing You Do.
Yes. Yes, true. And there's someone who again is actually good at embodying the kind of music that he's trying to capture, which from what I understand from Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, he kind of went many different places with the music that he did for them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And a quick tidbit about the Monkees, a couple of things. Every time I hear the Monkees and every time I hear Mike Nesmith, I am reminded that somebody once told me, and you can look this up, see if I'm still right, that Mike Nesmith's mother invented liquid paper, which we know as whiteout. I don't know if it has been verified, but I heard that once. And when I was a late teen, there was a show that was in development called The New Monkees. They were trying to reboot it with a new cast. I don't remember. I think it might have aired for a season or half a season. I actually, before I lived in New York, I drove up to New York to audition for that and did not get it.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's right. Yeah.
But I believe the Monkees reunited in both the 80s and 90s.
Yes.
They actually had a hit in 1986.
Was Then This Is Now? Is that
Yeah.
song? Yeah. Yeah. And I thought there might have been another minor hit too after that.
Yeah, and that was around the time that I think MTV was rerunning their show.
Yep.
So you can see that they had a lot more staying power than people might have thought in 1967.
Yeah, and you're right that they kept reuniting and touring and all that. I don't know if you would call fortunate or unfortunate enough to have seen the Monkees. Was it 3 years ago? Maybe right before Mike Nesmith died. It was just him and Mickey Dolenz and honestly a damn incredible backing band. And Mike Nesmith, you can tell, was not doing well and did his best to be present and do what he could do, and was really, as it is now, Mickey Dolenz kind of running the show with that. But it was, it was worth seeing.
So I think then we get into bands that were more heavily controlled and had less of their own talent. I'm thinking of the Archies weren't even, were just session musicians who were represented by a cartoon. But then when we get into the 70s, we get the Partridge Family.
Yep, they did, and there are songs of theirs they've done which still ring in my head. I mean, and I know that was David Cassidy, right, who was in that? Yeah, and so of course, before his brother went on to be a producer of some pretty incredible TV shows, Sean Cassidy, he had his own pretty big hit solo album in the mid 70s too. So they did all kind of spin off into something a little more real. And I mentioned the Brady Bunch and how I always think of that song, When It's Time to Change, but they put out like an album's worth of material, and a couple of which were released as singles. Seemed to be a big thing in the 70s where it was either live or even more often through cartoons like the original Josie and the Pussycats, like even I saw on one list Fat Albert and shows like that where they had fake acts doing music there with some, again, pretty solid session musicians doing it. Or even Sesame Street. When you think of that, I read that song in Sesame Street, and this kind of veers a little away from fake bands, but they did do fake stuff, in the Muppet Show and all that. The song 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 was sung by the Pointer Sisters.
Oh,
and I all my whole childhood I never knew that. I just read it recently. So there is a real crossover of some real musicians doing great work on behalf of fake acts.
What year was the Pointer Sisters song?
God, that would have been the mid 70s. It was before they had all of their bigger they had hits then, but their 70s hits, a lot of them I can't remember, but equally good hits as what they had in the 80s, but they weren't as big as they were in the 80s.
I'm quite fond of the SCTV's fake punk band, the Queen Haters. I don't know who played the music, who actually played the music, but it had all of the like John Candy was the drummer, looking very unhappy with this grimace on his face for the entire song. I think Joe Flaherty, played the singer with this heavy fake British accent.
God, that's great. I loved that show. I actually, when I used to buy DVDs, I bought the whole box set of that show. And anyone who's come from that show, I follow their career and everything. I'm going to have to look that up because I don't remember that band in particular.
It's actually a pretty good song. Musically, it's good. The lyrics are very funny. They seem to know what they're making fun of and have affection for it.
Yeah.
Quincy. Do you remember the famous anti-punk episode on Quincy?
Kind of, actually. I'm surprised I do, but I kind of remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, and then there was something similar, although a bit less malicious, on what was that cop show? Damn, I can't remember the name of it. It was the one with Eric Estrada.
Chips.
Yeah, I think there was a song called "I Dig Pain." It was by the fake punk band on either Chips or Quincy.
Oh wow, that's great.
Oh, Quincy was Next Stop Nowhere. Chips was "I Dig Pain."
Nice. Yeah, I know, and it's funny how a lot of those cop and medical shows, it's always if you're involved in a punk band, then you're, something bad is going to happen. It's either an injury or drugs or alcohol or something like that. And it's, they're always slightly, criminal. There seemed to be, right. So that trend kind of continued. And you mentioned SCTV, and we've certainly seen a lot of fake acts on SNL throughout the year. So a lot of sketch shows have done that. I even saw as recent as Key and Peele mentioned on the list that I saw where they did, fake music and fake acts. And, that leads me to, Flight of the Conchords, which of course is also more recent, but they ended up performing that stuff live, even though it was clearly meant to be parodies of different kinds of music,
There was a period point where they were actually the most popular New Zealand band or New Zealand artist ever in the US. I think Lord stole their thunder too much. Royals is way, way more popular than they were. But they're a Crowded House were really the only, and I guess before that, Split Ends were really the only New Zealand bands that had any real success in the US.
I had no idea those two were from New Zealand. I always grew up thinking they were from Australia. So that's good to know.
Yeah, in fact, I think the reason Split Ends ends with ENZ is a reference to New Zealand.
Oh my God. Wow. That now that all kind of comes together. That makes sense. Yeah, I've had an idea running through my head the whole time you're talking, which of course has completely escaped me. So that just shows what kind of a week it's been.
But there was a connection that just came to mind.
Oh, good.
There was a Flight of the Conchords were on Sub Pop. Sub Pop also put out the soundtrack album to a short-lived TV show called The Mayor, which was about a rapper in the Bay Area who runs for mayor to become as a publicity stunt, and he actually gets elected.
Yeah.
And every episode had him performing one song.
God, I forgot about that. Yes. Yeah, that was a pretty good show.
And the music was produced by the group Clipping.
Okay. I don't think I know that group. And they're on the Sub Pop label then?
Yeah. I guess that's how the soundtrack album came out on Sub Pop.
Oh, nice. Okay, I get it. Yeah, it's fascinating to me how I feel, and having done this myself, being an artist already, taking on another persona can be very freeing. And whether it's lyrically or maybe musically, although you usually stay in your lane, it's the idea of creating for some other act and knowing that act is fake kind of really opens up your ability to, write and perform in a slightly different way. So I could see the appeal of wanting to do that, I mean, you think of like, if I can go further in and say, I end up referring to a lot of cartoons, partly because I watched them with the kids, but also I just was like Adult Swim type stuff that I was interested in. And my band Rec covered the theme song to Aqua Teen Hunger Force on the first album, Parts and Labor. And I got permission directly from Schoolie D himself because he was affiliated with my manager. He wasn't managed by him, but I think his associate managed him or something like that. So it was kind of nice to get a sanctioned okay, to do that song. But when you look through a show like that, or a show like an equally weird show, Space Ghost or Metalocalypse, which honestly, I read an article about the guy who produced the music for the band Death Clock there and how diligent he was at making it real metal and not and when you listen to it, and kind of like death metal, even I guess the name would signify that it is authentic, and then you have things like Space Ghost or SpongeBob who put out soundtracks. I mean, The Simpsons have too, so you think of that, and those can be streamed, as far as I know, everywhere. And they got into some weird shit, but did a pretty great job of doing it, and again, Teen Titans would be another example of that.
Yeah, I remember quote unquote Bart Simpson having a hit with "Do the Bartman."
Oh, yeah. Right. I forgot that was a hit. Yeah. And I guess, and it makes sense because, again, cartoons give you freedom that you might not have in real life for so many reasons. And in the second half, we're going to mention a couple of cartoon or non-human, let's say, acts that weren't necessarily related to any TV show or film, like gorillas and the Vocaloids and all of that stuff. But there is that sense of freedom that you get, again, from performing and recording for something that isn't real, you know. And I think that we're kind of in an area right now where we're lucky in that, in terms of this conversation, in that we are mentioning acts that are super well regarded, and or shows that had music that was fairly well regarded, if not more so. And we haven't even gotten into some of the big ones. Speaking of SNL, the Blues Brothers.
When I looked them up, I was surprised to see just how popular they were. I guess they were a bit. I'm a bit too young to have many firsthand memories of them. I watched the movie in my first year of college, which was 1988.
Okay.
But I looked up some clips of them performing on SNL from the late 70s.
Yeah, and I do have a fairly good memory of them being on that show, but then certainly the movie itself and afterwards spinning off. And you had mentioned when John Belushi died, Jim Belushi took over. And I believe that since then, that idea of the Blues Brothers has essentially been franchised. And they're performing all over the place with just it's really the fact that it's like somewhat, agitated blues rock music with suits and hats, and that's the Blues Brothers.
Yeah, there was a musical that started out in New Zealand, which tells a different story than the movie.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that. Jeez, that. Don't even get into. I mean, so many musicals have been just reboots of things like that, and that's one perfect example. Or you get. And again, this I think you could almost say this is tied to, because there was a film. You're thinking of sketch shows, and we talked about SNL and we talked about the SCTV. Monty Python is a big one, and when they all spun off, and a few of them did the Ruddles, and that was a huge Beatles parody, and they had that. I still haven't seen that movie, but I know about the band, and that spun off all these other Beatles parodies that were meant to be humorous, not in the vein of the Monkees, which they were funny on the show, but they had real songs, and these were all just parodies, of the Beatles, and so many of those went on to take a life of their own.
The Ruddles were talented enough musicians that they were really good at doing a pastiche of various Beatles. I've seen the movie. I haven't listened to their music on its own, but I remembered holding up pretty well in the context of the film. Like Eric Idle was one of the members.
Yes.
And Spinal Tap began as a sketch in 1979 on a comedy show hosted by Rob Reiner. And it was the same three guys, with Loudon Wainwright III played their keyboardist.
Yeah.
And they did a song called Rock and Roll Nightmare.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a lot cheesier than the movie. Like it feels like a kind of tossed off comedy sketch. The humor and the songs in the movie are a lot more carefully planned.
Right. I haven't seen that sketch. I have to look it up, but that kind of brings up the last point I want to get to before this half is finished. And that is, yes, there's a new film coming out, and that is very exciting. But what you mentioned to me, Steve, a little while ago, is that we have seen them pop up periodically, whether it's they put out a music video for a song or they were on a talk show or whatever else it was. And I would just assume, well, these are guys who can do whatever they want and they're excited and they want to do it, which may be true. But you said there was another reason why they keep showing up like that.
Yeah, they had to get the film produced, to get the money to finance it. They had to sign away the rights to the characters to the distributor, which I think was a company called Embassy that went out of business, and it got bought by L'Oreal. So they were able to buy the rights back. The Guest, McKean, and Shearer, but there was a catch. Every 3 years, they have to appear in public as Spinal Tap. So once they got the rights back, they released an album, Break Like the Wind, and they released a second album in 1999. But to hold on to the IP of Spinal Tap, they have to make public appearances in character every couple of years. So that's why you'll see them pop up on Jimmy Kimmel or a talk show in a way that seems really random.
I love that in the sense that they are, doing business for themselves and struck a deal that they found was amenable. And at the same time, it compels them to take these characters on again and to do more music, which is a treat for the people who want to see them again.
Yeah, and Christopher Guest kept going with the idea of fake bands and documentaries about them with A Mighty Wind, right, where I think all three of the Spinal Tap guys appear as the Folksmen. Oh. And they in fact they did a show where the Folksmen opened for Spinal Tap. And
nice.
I listened to some of the music they made out after This Is Spinal Tap. Mm-hmm. And the problem is I don't know how many people listen to the Spinal Tap soundtrack album for pleasure. Those songs work really well in the context of the film, but right, they're kind of deliberately mediocre music. And right, the quality didn't get better when they were when it had to stand on its own.
That kind of makes sense to me with anything that has to do with humor, because the context is so important and the visuals even. And unless you are an absolute genius, or that your approach and your focus is that way, you're actively trying not to be too good because you want it to be a parody, which, unless you understand where it comes from, right, just listening to the recording might not be that satisfying.
Yeah, compared to the live performance of Stonehenge, it's hard to see how any audio only recording could match that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. So we're coming up on the halfway point here. We've already hit some pretty major acts, and we've got a few more coming up in the second half. But as I mentioned, it's going to be a very slightly different approach to the fake idea of fake artists. So stay tuned with us. Have your questions ready and all of that stuff. It's not that this is a live episode, but I know this is going to spark some conversation, and I'd love for us to be able to answer those questions for you once this airs. So give us a minute for the mid-roll, and we will be right back. Hey, thanks for checking out this episode of Music is Not a Genre. If you'd like to learn more about this podcast, if you'd like to learn more about the music I do with my band Rec or any other projects or anything else about me, go to nickdematteo.com. That's Nick, DEMATTEO.com. And everything is there. There's even a link to a merch store where you can get t-shirts and mugs and hats and totes and notebooks and so many other things. I'm always adding new products there. Great way to support the podcast. And finally, go to patreon.com/music is not a genre if you'd really like to show your support. My fans and lovely family there get exclusives and other perks and early releases, and they get to suggest topics for future podcasts as well. Thanks for listening to the mid-roll. Now back to the show. And we are back. Thank you for hanging for that mid-roll. Back for the second half of talking about fake bands, the realest fake bands. And Steve had a good suggestion, which is we're going to use, since I mentioned it in the first half, as a jumping off point, since we're talking now mostly about acts that were not associated with film or television, or at least not initially, let's say, we can start with a fairly well-known fake band called Gorillaz.
Yeah, they were created by Damon Albarn, the singer of Blur, after Blur broke up. They worked with several different producers, and they tend to have a different. Albarn sings on most of their songs, but they tend to have a featured guest singer or rapper as well on every song.
Yeah, it was quite different from the music that Blur made, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, there's much more of a hip hop and pop element with a lot less. There's still a degree of indie rock in there, but there's I think it may have been a response to the way that Britpop was seen as something that was only looking back to rock music of the made in Britain in the 60s and 70s, whereas the Gorillaz were much more in tune with what was happening in electronic music and also working with a lot of black musicians, whereas Britpop got a lot of criticism for being extremely white.
Yeah, and when I did the episode on Oasis, I got a little bit into Britpop and saw that, through the 90s, it was relatively healthy, but as the late 90s wore on, there was quite a bit of backlash at it being a little too insular and kind of focused on, like you said, that music era. And some of those acts tried to morph themselves and add different elements. So there was actually a couple of Oasis albums, at least one in the 2000s, where they added a lot of electronics and loops and things like that. But I don't think anyone went quite as far as Damon Albarn did with Gorillaz.
Yeah, did you ever see them live?
No.
Jamie Hewlett, I believe, did all the visuals for the band, and they had four members who were these fictional cartoon characters. They had a very elaborate mythos. I was more just into their music. I think Demon Days is a great album, and I've seen their videos, but I didn't get into it enough to be able to follow the storyline going on behind them.
Mm-hmm.
But I know that there is an ongoing storyline, and I think live they project holograms of the cartoon characters.
Oh yes, I do remember that from a little while back, and I didn't get into the narrative much either. I love the visuals, and I thought it was great that they could do live performances like that. But I don't remember. It to me, it's akin to, even though this is really not the same thing or the same subject, but the Gerard Way from My Chemical Romance, like, co-wrote a series of comic books, right, which were the Umbrella Academy or whatever. He has a big hand in that, and there seems to be more, even throughout history, but more so now, a connection between comics and fake music, or real musicians and comics, and that kind of thing. When you think of the Archies and when you think of the Gorillas, how there's a narrative there, and those are clearly like cartoon, very comic book styled cartoons.
Also, anime. I watched part of a Hatsune Miku concert yesterday, and she's obviously designed to look like an anime girl.
Yes, and that brings up another facet of what we're talking about, which is the whole Vocaloids craze, which I only know what I know because my youngest child was super, super, super into the Vocaloids, especially characters that had more gender fluidity and things like that. And I discovered that there are over 100 Vocaloid characters, and that they're associated, it's from Japan, but they've spread all over the world, and they're associated with video games and that kind of thing. And yes, it's like anime styled animation and video gaming and all of that. And Will and I went to a concert of theirs at the Hammerstein in New York a few years ago, and it was a holographic projection of Hatsune Miku. But I assume that there was someone behind the scenes singing the music live, although I couldn't verify that. I believe that was true, but I know for a fact that the band itself was live, and both the guitarist, the drummer in particular, were doing what I would characterize as a lot of progressive licks within music that you think would be just simplified for kids. But that's been a hallmark of a lot of what Japan has done in the last 15 years, at least, combining like prog metal with pop, with other kinds of music. And the Vocaloids were a huge factor in that happening.
Yeah, in the concert I saw, which was shot in 2016, she performed with a live band. It felt very surreal to watch a hologram and then they would cut to the guitarist doing a solo. Then they would cut to an arena full of actual people waving glow sticks, and they have a choreography for her dancing for each song, which determines the rhythm in which you're supposed to wave your glow stick.
Oh, I didn't remember that. We did have glow sticks, and that was, I think that might have actually been the year that we saw the concert. So it was probably the same tour.
I'm not sure if Vocaloid involves a live singer at any point. I think it's a software. It may be a software bank that has recordings of an actual singer, but you can input your own lyrics and program the melody.
Oh, right. That was part of the video game portion of it. Yeah. And in fact, and I think I want to say this was a user, although it could have been the company itself, had a Vocaloid perform some kind of Eastern European folk song with like a heavy dance beat, like a heavy techno beat. And that YouTube video, again, this was around the same time, like the mid late teens, was super, super viral. And a weird one to go viral, but those things kind of happen now and then where you get like, folky stuffs like, Buffalo. What was that? Malcolm McLaren song?
Buffalo Gals.
Yeah, where you have that kind of folky thing, but put to some kind of funky or danceable music. And this one just took off like crazy. I mean, at the time, Vocaloids were everywhere. And that was just an example of that.
Yeah, researching this, I came across some American commercials that Hatsune Miku appeared in from around 2012. I didn't realize just how popular she was outside of Japan until I began researching this.
Well, yeah, and I kind of knew that, but didn't realize how far that stretched because they're still touring.
Well, she doesn't have to worry about burnout.
No, burnout, aging, things like that. Yeah, yeah. Those damn holograms have it easy. So and so that kind of brings up, I have and I know there's a couple of other acts you want to mention, but I think this is a perfect time to segue into the idea of this is sometimes user generated, sometimes computer generated AI that's creating something like a Hatsune Miku. And we know now, more so in the last 2-3 years, let's say, with the ChatGPT craze and all of that stuff, that everyone is up in arms, and some rightfully so, about how much AI has infiltrated the creative process. And although, for example, my wife and I, she'll point out on Instagram pictures that are just so well done, but still so clearly AI that, and part of it is you can't imagine that existing in real life or whatever else it might be, but there is still some element, which I believe is also true sonically, where if you are paying enough attention, you can tell the difference between something that was organically created and something created by AI, like those fake Nirvana songs that came out a few years ago and all of that, where you're like, yeah, oh, I get it. They're catching the flavor of it, but it's similar to how fake bands in shows catch the flavor of what they're doing, but you can just tell that it's not the real thing.
There was an AI created project I listened to a few weeks ago. It's supposed to be a concept album from 1973 by a proto-punk band whose singer was a Vietnam vet singing about his experiences. And it was okay, but it sounded like if you told me it was this kind of third string, I don't know, third string band from Detroit that opened for the Stooges once in 1973, it would be believable. It didn't come off incredibly uh, I mean, it was trying to be aggressive and without being incredibly slick, but there's a degree of inspiration that's not there. But of course, there's plenty of music made by humans that's just ripping off other artists with
Right.
no inspiration.
And that's the interesting crossover, because I was actually going to use, I forget the, yeah, I guess inspiration, or what the word you use, that creative spark is, to me, clearly missing. And I'm not saying this as a criticism of the idea of AI in general, because there are ways it can be used that can really, work. Uh, Hopefully, and it will put some artists out of business, and it will honestly give other people work who know how to manipulate the processors and software and all of that better, to the point where they can get something more organic out of it. But it is similar to, like you said, like it's that pale imitation, that if what you're into is third string music of whatever kind of music that is, then you could totally be okay with that. But I have listened to, not a whole lot, but for example, for the Beatles cover band, there's one guy who was just obsessed with it and would play a bunch of different tracks and say how amazing this is and how much it sounds like them and all of that stuff. And in every single case, I was like, yeah, all right. It would probably, if the Beatles had put out, 500 songs instead of 260 or whatever they did, then they might have gotten to a point where they made music that mediocre. That was pretty much how it sounded to me, including and even the fake Nirvana and all of that stuff. And I think that a lot of that is also true for quite a bit of the music that was generated and maybe is still generated by things like Vocaloids and those programs. But then you start to see that crossover where you have an act like Vocaloids incorporating actual musicians, and in many cases actual songwriters, to where it takes it to that slight next level where it becomes this kind of meshing of the human and the artificial in the way that we've always been fascinated with, but that which really started to kind of take hold of the imagination in the 70s with bands like Kraftwerk, and moving on to, all that kind of electronic thing, and artists seeing how far they could push the idea of having the computer generate the music itself.
The Man Machine, as Kraftwerk named one of their albums.
Oh, yeah, there you go. Exactly.
I've noticed YouTube filling up with a lot of AI generated kind of novelty music that's like take an artist from one genre, have them quote unquote perform a song that seems very incongruous. So I'll get recommend things like Tony Bennett performing Master of Puppets,
Oh,
or Billie Eilish performing Straight Outta Compton.
right. Yes. And I think for the novelty aspect of it, that's a lot of fun. But it's clear that that's not something that's going to revolutionize, music. I mean, I think that the best it can do is give other artists the idea of crossing genres and trying to do that themselves with real music, which the midpoint of that is there are a lot of Instagram people who, like, good musicians. For example, there's this one dude who will do yacht rock versions of metal songs and really bring out the lyrics to the forefront there, but really kind of funky, almost R&B-ish yacht rock. And then there's another dude who's from the metal world who will take like a song from NSYNC or something that's completely non-metal and turn it into a metal song. And these are real singers and real musicians really producing these kind of mashups, which is to me the midpoint between this artificially created mashup that you talked about, or musicians like, let's say, Gorillaz, taking the idea of hip hop and electronic meshed with Britpop and creating something new.
I think Poppy is the artist who's kind of best developed these ideas, both when she was just making YouTube videos and in her own music. Her first album was called Poppy Computer, and although she's a real woman, in her early videos she played this robotic pop star who was programmed by the conspiracy. There were a lot of references to the Illuminati and Satanism in her early videos,
Wow.
and she spoke in this extremely blank voice and said things like, "It's very important to be famous," or "I like making high quality content." She, but then she became more serious about music. She got signed to Island Records and put out her first EP in 2016, which was 2 years after the YouTube channel started. She made a pilot for a TV series called I'm Poppy, which would develop the character further, like how she gets wrapped up into the conspiracy, and they promote her as the next big thing. But there's just a pilot; it never got picked up. Although you can see the pilot on YouTube. But she was working with a producer named Titanic Sinclair, who was they were dating also, and he was abusive towards her. So when they split up, she dropped the weird video aspect and the character and made music from her own perspective. She's gone back and made a few YouTube videos, which are a lot. This was about 2 years ago. They're a lot more positive. She used to do things like there's one video where she loads a gun, and it's only 30 seconds long, but it's like she says in the same voice, like, "I'm instructing you how to load a gun." And the more recent videos are like her smiling and eating candy and cookies.
Oh, wow. What a shift. Yeah.
And she just released her sixth album last Friday,
What's it called?
Negative Spaces.
Oh, nice.
She's also gone from pop to metal. There's still an element of pop in there. She's done some extremely strange songs that one of them sounds like a mashup of the Mamas. Like if you alternated the Mamas and Papas and Nine Inch Nails in the same song.
Mm,
But she's the only solo woman to have a Grammy nomination in the heavy metal category.
wow. Wow. That's a big change. Yeah.
So she started off making videos about this fictional pop star, and then eventually became one.
Yes. And I love that idea because I do think there are artists who can go in both directions. So you have artists like Bowie or in to some degree the Beatles who wanted to take on this persona of, a different band. We'll call ourselves Sergeant Peppers and blah 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 because it sounds like a San Francisco band, or Bowie taking on all the different characters, allowing you to go places you don't want to go. But there have been artists who started out deliberately as a persona or a parody who then went on to have actual careers like Poppy, like I won't say, I mean, Childish Gambino's not a parody, but that was like a side project for the actor Donald Glover. Boy, I don't know why I blanked on his name. And that became highly regarded music. And you mentioned
Yeah,
somebody named Michael Dappa who had a similar
yeah.
trajectory.
He's a British comedian who has several characters. One of whom is a rapper named Big Shaq. And as Big Shaq, he released a song called "Man's Not Hot," which is kind of a parody of drill music.
Hmm.
And that came out in 2017. That became one of the biggest UK hip hop songs, at least up to that time. That
Wow.
was 7 years ago, but it was really huge. But he's never been able to capture the same audience with his music.
Hmm.
I, he has several other characters. Like one of them is a professor from Ghana. He did a version of "Man's Not Hot" as that character with the same lyrics.
Hmm.
And he has a character who's another character who's a rapper who's a rival to Big Shaq. But he still has a YouTube channel, but it's kind of going out in all different directions. I don't think. I mean, he was never like a full time musician. It was more. I guess there's an overlap with comedy music, and uh, the kind of thing that we've been talking about, and that he's a comedian who makes music, and it clicked for one song, but after that, people lost interest.
Well, and yeah, and I even did an episode a few seasons ago about how closely tied music and comedy are, and you can see this. And what I think makes the difference, right, is that person not just an actual musician, but do they consider themselves a real musician and a real music creator and make that a priority in their career, or did they just happen to stumble on something that ended up being really well liked, and that, like Michael Dappa, and then the effort to recreate it has more to do with wanting to repeat that success in both comedy and humor, but not really wanting to be a full-fledged musician or creator the way Childish Gambino did for so many years.
Yeah, the American rapper Lil Dicky is maybe a better. He admits that he always wanted to be a comedian, and he got his own TV show called Dave. Uh,
Oh yeah.
but he admitted that he only made music to be able to get into the position where he could work in TV or film, and that was always his goal. I think he put out one album. Uh, he had a hit with a song with Chris Brown called Freaky Friday, and then he's only released two albums in 10 years or something like that.
Mm.
That seems very cynical.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Cynical. It's a good way to put it. I know artists, and in a sense, I'm one of them because I'm here doing a podcast. And the primary reason for me starting this podcast was to call more attention to my own music. And I almost always feature a song, and to really try to expand my ability to do more work as a musician. But you can be good at two different things. So you can be like have whatever you want to think of. Oh, now I'm blank. Who's the guy who plays shoot. He was on My So-Called Life. Oh, Jared Leto. So he has a highly successful band and has been a highly successful actor. And whether you like or dislike what he does, he is committed to both of them and doing both of them with equal passion and interest. Whereas you might have somebody like the Kevin Bacon who does the Bacon Brothers, and they have a wonderful time at it, or when Bruce Willis was doing music or whatever, but clearly they are actors first.
Yeah, there are a lot of actors who have a hobby playing music.
Yeah.
To be honest, that's how the Blues Brothers come across to me.
Absolutely. 100%. And I think it's why I really enjoyed the skits in the movie and never saw anything else from them, because it did feel a little bit like review show style, blues rock music as opposed to the real thing. Not that the musicians weren't good. It's just that their approach had more to do, with them dabbling in music as opposed to really wanting to make a go of it.
Yeah, I saw a flyer a couple weeks ago where Russell Crowe's band was playing some club in the West Village.
Oh yeah, 30-foot odd of grunts or something like that. Is that the name of it?
Of the club.
No, his band is called that. Something like that.
I don't remember. His name was featured pretty prominently.
Gotcha. Okay.
They're like David Duchovny makes music, Dennis Quaid,
Oh
Kiefer
yeah.
Sutherland, and from everything I've heard, no one except their family and friends would be listening if they weren't celebrities.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a lot of that. And then you have actors who cross over into acting who started in music or vice versa. When you have like wow, man, this is not a day for remembering names. But Ariana Grande, who I know sang when she was on doing the kids circuit, but I got to know her through the comedy show on Nickelodeon that my kids watched, and didn't realize until years later how committed she was to being a musician. And even though I actually think she's fun, she's super funny as an actor, and honestly prefer that side of it, but she does both well.
Olivia Rodrigo started out on High School Musical. It felt like she came out of nowhere when Driver's License came out and debuted at #1. And then I learned that she had starred on High School Musical, and I was like, oh, that's how she built up enough of an audience that
Yeah.
when she starts making music outside that, Hannah Montana and Miley Cyrus are an interesting sample
Wow. Yeah.
because Miley made two albums as Hannah.
Right. Did she? I think she made two, right? And was the third one the one where it was like a kind of a crossover from Hannah to her, or was that the second one?
I think that was the third one.
I think it was the third one. Yeah. And right. And so that was meant to, and you can tell she probably wanted to just be in the music world eventually anyway. But it's interesting that it might not have happened if she hadn't had that successful show. And people say the same thing in a different way about Drake.
Yeah, although I don't see that much of a connection between like Degrassi High outside of Canada is I remember it airing on PBS. I'm not sure which incarnation he was on,
Yeah.
but I don't think it's like nearly popular enough to for someone to be able to launch a career off it. And
Oh,
if anything, people made fun of him at first because
right.
he came off as this. He played a character named Wheelchair Jimmy, and I've seen clips from him around that time, and he just seems like this very nerdy suburban teenager.
Yeah, which is what they do say about him. And right. And I think his, his success, including on Degrassi, had a lot to do with the fact that also that he had already had industry connections. So that might be a different story there. Yeah. So we're, coming to the end of this discussion here. Is there anything we didn't cover that you might want to mention before I get to some conclusions?
Well, AI is a huge subject. I was talking about it with a friend a couple of months ago, and he said the problem with AI isn't AI, it's late stage capitalism. And I think that as a result of that, it's going to be used in the most exploitative and least creative ways,
Mm-hmm.
rather than, say, helping. Like it's well known that for the last few months of post production on Marvel films, they expect uh, people to work 80 hours a week finishing CGI and animation. Like if you could use AI to speed that process up so that people only have to work 40 hours a week, but they have, well-paying, interesting jobs. But Disney and Marvel aren't going to do that. They're going to use it to eliminate as many of those jobs as they can.
Wow. What a great way to say it, though, that the problem isn't the tool, it's the society we're living in. It's the fact that we've spent so many decades now, honestly, building to the point where there is nothing more important than the people who are making money, making more money, and everyone else suffers, that it doesn't really matter what the tool is. It could be AI, it could be any aspect of computers themselves, it could be every other tool that's been invented that someone once said, whether it was 20, 50, or 100 years ago, this is going to destroy culture or the working world or whatever it is, in industrialization and all of that. If you have robber baron type people who are going to exploit it to the point of not making it beneficial, the way it was said, appliances or computers would give everyone more time in their lives, but what it did was allowed employees to ask employers to ask employees to be more productive, quote unquote, which just means work harder for the same amount of money. And if you can get them to do that, then yes, you don't have to hire as many people. So those people who would have gotten jobs to help you out aren't making any money at all. So that is that, and that's part of the kind of sickness that we are would love to correct, but unfortunately might not be able to do for several more years.
At the same time, there have been apocalyptic predictions when drum machines were invented, when synthesizers became popular in the early 80s.
Mm-hmm.
There are still a load of people who think music made with samples isn't real music.
Yep.
But despite that, there were still, there's still a demand for to, guitars and drums.
Yes, there was a lot of that on, Broadway and stage shows where pits were being replaced by recorded music. But then there's a lot of people, musicians working in the pit. Or when my dad was really heavily in, making a living in live music, and the DJ craze and karaoke craze and all those things came up, he and his compatriots would always say, that's going to cost us work. And listen, all of these things do cost other people work to some degree. It's the balancing out that happens to where there's a craze like AI, whatever else, and then things you mentioned, and that craze balloons and some people lose out. The dust settles. There is more of a mix of the new and the old. So some of that musician work might not be there, but a lot of it still is. But then there's work for people who do other things like, programming and sampling and DJing and hosting karaoke or creating AI or asking AI to do whatever it does. Those are jobs that are created. And I'm not saying it's one to one. It does affect things, but I do agree that there's usually an apocalyptic prediction that ends up being a whole lot less apocalyptic than people say it will.
Yeah, I guess the big question is, it seems inevitable there's going to be a song completely created with AI that becomes a hit.
Mm. Wow.
And when will that happen, and what will that lead into?
I think that's the greatest question, and honestly a great way to kind of come to the conclusions of this episode, because it's the one thing I've been waiting for, is to hear a song created by AI that would just blow me away. In the way I've been talking about how some of these fake bands created by real musicians have blown me away with the music they've created. AI hasn't done that yet. No matter what we want to say, it's wowed people as a novelty, but it hasn't gotten to that point. So, and I think that's a great question to leave with the people listening and watching this, actually. And to kind of sum up by saying, what we can, I think, all agree on is that wherever the music comes from, and you mentioned this, Steve, whether it's from real people and real bands or some amalgam of real and fake or totally fake, there's always going to be that mix of amazing music, genius, great music, good music, fair music, poor music, terrible music, all the way up and down the line. With, again, the exception, AI hasn't really gotten to greatness yet. And I'm sure at some point it will, depending on who's pulling the strings behind the scenes. But that this, I think what this says is that the threat is minor, to quote the name of a band, Minor Threat, but and not something that we should all get absolutely crazed over, because most of us have the judgment and kind of experience to discern when something isn't real. We may fool ourselves into thinking it's real because it's fun, but most of us can tell when it's not. And so thank you, Steve, for hanging out with us for this really interesting discussion.
Sure.
And thank you, everybody out there, for watching. I'm going to leave you with a song that I created by request by a music supervisor who was looking for Hungarian pop music. And I did a deep dive into it and found some amazing music out there that doesn't sound like you think it does. Ended up creating a band called Pescelet, which I forget what it means. It means coming from the town of Pécs, which is where half of my family comes from. And the song is called Mind Repuljon, which I did an American version of called Whatever We Have to Do to Wake Up High. But I did an entire Hungarian version of this, which you will hear in the next few seconds, again, by the fake band Pescelet. And again, it was fun to be able to take on a persona and do something I wouldn't normally do. So thank you again, Steve. Thank you, all of you out there, for watching and listening. Please let me know what you think of all this and all the questions you have, and like and subscribe and whatever else people tell you to do. My objectives here are music, conversation, and connection. And I will talk to you next week.
Thanks.